Hello, welcome to the ongoing Earnscliffe webinar series, this one being post-election analysis. My name is Alan Gregg, and as always, I'm joined by a number of my colleagues with extensive experience in politics and political campaigns, including Brittany Kerr, who is our National Government Relations Practice Lead out of the Vancouver office. While in government, she was also the British Columbia advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada and also served as the National Campaign co-chair for the Liberals' 2019 election effort. Shakir Chambers is out of our Toronto office. He had spent time as a staffer in Stephen Harper's Prime Minister office, went on to be a senior policy advisor for the Minister of International Trade and served in the same capacity as a policy advisor to Doug Ford's 2018 campaign. Marianne Carter is a principal in our Ottawa office, background in law, served a stint at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, as well as spending some time in Paris at the ICC International Court of Arbitration. Out of Toronto, one of our communication specialists, Chris Ball. Previous to that, he was a senior executive at both CBC and Vice Media, served as an advisor to Jack Layton, Andrea Horvath, the NDP leader in Ontario, and has worked on numerous campaigns municipally, provincially, and federally. And finally, we have Hillary Martin, who is a senior member of our public opinion research team, who's going to start us off by going through our weekly data that we've collected. But before she does, I just want to remind everyone who's tuned in that there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to both ask an individual panelist or the entire panelist any questions, and that Marianne is going to be monitoring that. And from time to time, we'll go to her and she will pose a question to the larger group. So with that introduction, Hillary, take it away.
Hi, Alan. It's great to be back again this week. We were in field in the final days of the campaign, the 17th to the 19th, trying to get a sense of how Canadians were making up their mind in those final days. And as always, this was an online survey of approximately 1,500 Canadians conducted over that time frame. One thing we were curious about is how the vote was distributed between those who intended to vote for a given party today and how they voted in 2019. And on the left, you'll see that's vote intention for the 2021 election. And then the colored bars indicate how those folks voted in 2019. And for Conservatives, the majority are returning Conservative voters, though it looks like perhaps they were able to convince some Liberals to join their ranks. Among current Liberal voters, the 2/3, 68%, said that they voted Liberal in 2019. And it seems like that's really where the most of their support came from, maybe convinced a few NDP voters to join their ranks as well, but just 10%. For the NDP, the majority of their support comes from either former NDP voters or former Liberal voters. And I would note that if any one party was able to capitalize on the collapse of the Green vote, it seems to have been the NDP. About 8% of their voters said that that's who they voted for in the last election. And then finally, I draw your attention to the bar at the bottom of the screen, which is the Rppc voters. Now, because of the sample size, this is just 56 individuals who answered in our survey that they intended to vote for the People's Party. So interpret these results with caution, but because there's a lot of interest in the topic, we wanted to present them. If you add up the proportion of PPC supporters who said that last time they voted either for the PPC or the Conservatives, that's over half of their vote. But I would also draw your attention to the fact that if you factor in the Liberal vote at 30%, 6% former NDP voters and 5% former Green voters, that's another 40% of that vote that is coming from a party that is not traditionally conservative party. So if the PPC continues to be a factor in coming elections, it'll definitely be interesting to see if that mix of vote holds and who exactly these folks are.
It also just really points to the fluidity of voting today. I mean, no party is able to retain more than 3/4 of the vote they had in 2019. And the second point that you make, Hillary, I think very, very important is while the People's Party was disproportionately made up of former Conservative voters, certainly not all.
Exactly. Moving on from this question, we, as you know, have been tracking second choice support throughout the campaign, and there were a few notable developments among people who hadn't yet voted in the last days of the campaign. First of all, among Liberal voters, previously we'd seen a reluctance for folks to say that their second choice was the Conservatives, but in the final days, there was a marked increase in the proportion of Liberal voters who said that they would say their second choice are the Conservatives. Secondly, among NDP voters, over the course of the campaign, a growing trend of more and more saying that their second choice would likely be the Liberals.
And that too is very interesting to me, because if you just go back, we talked, back in at the start of the campaign, that the Conservative strategy of kind of moving to the center was a function of not having any second choice support at all. They just simply did not have enough second choice support to grow their vote. What this suggests to me is that while they might not have been able to convince a lot of Liberal and NDP voters to actually vote for them, they were able to get especially Liberal voters to at least consider them, to open their mind, to choose them as their second choice. So they didn't get to the finish line, but they certainly accomplished something that they set out to do at the start of the campaign.
Indeed. Sorry, technical difficulties. Next slide. One other thing we wanted to investigate was when the supporters for each party made up their mind and decided to vote for that party and that candidate. And we can see here, as one might expect, that the Conservative and Liberal support is largely baked in from the beginning. Before the election was called, almost half of their supporters said that they had decided that that's who they were going to vote for. And then the other half decided during the election campaign. The NDP voters are a bit different. About a third of them had decided prior to the election that that's where they'd put their vote, but the majority made up their minds during the election campaign. So a bit more effort on the NDP's part there to convince folks to vote for them was required. And then among PPC voters, again, caution with the sample size, just 56 people, but it makes sense that the majority of their supporters decided to vote for them sometime between the election was called and election day, rather than prior to that election being called.
It's become a cliche that campaigns matter, but here you see it. Over half of the electorate is making their decision in the actual writ period, not before.
Yeah. All right, and then finally, we wanted to take a look at some of the factors that traditionally seem to influence people's votes and have them be able to compare them on a scale of importance. So for each of the factors down the left side of the screen, we asked respondents whether that factor was something that was very important to how they make up their mind as to who to vote for, somewhat important, not very important, or not at all important. And voters said that the most important thing for them is their support for the ideas and policies of the party that they are voting for, followed by the positive impression they have of the leader of the party that they are voting for. Not far behind, opposition to the ideas and policies of a given party, and then negative impression of the leader of any given party. So all of those have 3/4 of voters saying that those are a very important or somewhat important factor in their decision, whereas the local candidate and just the habit of always voting for that party are less important. Now, it is instructive to break this down by vote intention, which we have done in the next slide. And while these factors are all important to all voters, regardless of political affiliation, at least the first 4 are, but there is a difference in terms of the intensity of importance among some of these voters. So for example, to begin, we see that amongst Conservative, Liberal, and NDP voters, support for the ideas and policies of the party that they are voting for, that's the most important thing. However, NDP and Liberal voters much more likely to feel that way than Conservative voters. Sticking with the Conservatives, we see the next most important thing is the opposition to the ideas and policies of a given party, followed by negative impressions of a certain party's leader. And we'll get into who that leader might be in just a moment. If you continue down with the NDP and Liberal voters, they look sort of similar in that the second most important thing is the positive impression of the leader that they are voting for, third most important is opposition to the ideas and policies of a given party, and then negative impression of the leader of any given party. We actually see that liberals are a bit more likely to say that's very important than NDP voters. And that's worth noting, that NDP voters don't seem to be highly motivated by the negative impression that they have of any given leader. And when it comes to, who they have a negative impression of, whose policies they have a negative impression of, among conservative voters, it's largely Liberal Party. Among Liberal voters, it's the Conservatives and the People's Party, and same as with the NDP. When it comes to leaders, the next slide, we see that the Conservatives, it's, their negative opinions are mostly directed at Justin Trudeau. But then for Liberal and NDP voters, it's Aaron O'Toole and Maxime Bernier.
We've talked in the past about the porousness of the Liberal NDP vote, and you can just see how similar their motivations are here in terms of who the good guys are and who the enemy is. Very interesting. Before we let you go, though, Hillary, I think there's some questions from the people who are viewing. So, Mariana, you got anything there that you want to raise?
Yeah, there's several questions, and they all link in one way or another to the interesting dynamic around the PPC vote. And I'll try and thread them together somewhat, Hillary, so we can be a bit more efficient. And so ultimately, a number of the participants are looking for you to expand on where the PPC votes came from. Did they mostly come from the Tories, all parties? How does someone go from voting Liberal or NDP in 2019 and potentially voting PPC? Was it mostly a phenomenon due to the pandemic, or is it here to stay as a new party of the right? And finally, someone's asking if there were any Bloc Québécois defections to the PPC. So if you could sort of elaborate on that, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, so of course, this has been a story throughout much of the campaign. Some polls having the PPC higher than it ended up being. We always sort of had them in the final days around the 4 or 5% mark. And with the caveat that I said at the beginning, our sample size for this group of voters is small. So I would treat this more as a qualitative rather than a statistically rigorous quantitative assessment. But we do see in our data their support coming not exclusively from the Conservative Party. And in terms of the motivation of why a former Liberal voter might vote for the People's Party or a New Democrat or a Green, that is something that we can only sort of guess at and make some assumptions about without asking those people. This is where qualitative research again would come in really handy, but it could have to do with opposition to pandemic measures, vaccine hesitancy, as the People's Party sort of established themselves as the party that was opposed to vaccine mandates and some of the public health restrictions that remain in place today.
And I think the earlier research showed it is a surprising profile for those voters, that they aren't all, as we might expect, kind of old, uneducated, rural voters. In fact, we saw a spike in PPC support among young people, those under the age of 34. And when you look at, again, with Hillary's cautionary remarks in mind, that this is a small sample size because they only got 5% of the popular vote. When you look at their motivations for voting, they're not only more negative than other voters, but they're negative across the board. I mean, they don't like anyone else's policies. They don't like any of the leaders. And there seems to be a real kind of anti-establishment trend. The big question embedded in that question is the pandemic something that is very unique to their motivation at this particular point in time? And we just don't know yet, but clearly that's something that's going to be a big part of political strategy going forward. And I want to talk about that in the course of the conversation that's going to follow. So Hillary, thank you very much. As always, really good data, really good presentation. We really appreciate it. It sets the table for us, gives us a perspective that we use all the time in our regular work that most don't have. So we're very lucky to have you. Thanks so much.
Great.
Take care.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure to participate these past few weeks.
Now, I want to spend most of our time thinking forward, because that's what we do at Earnscliffe. But first, there are some parts of this campaign that I don't think have been explained that well. But before we even get there, I want to go around the clock very quickly, each one of you. What was your top line assessment? What was your major takeaway in this election? Starting with you, Brittany.
Top line assessment of the election results. Well, the Liberals won the election. Seat count remained virtually unchanged, and voter turnout wasn't what anyone wanted. But the Liberals did form government at the end of the day, so I think that that was a win, obviously, for them. Overwhelmingly, Liberals swept urban centers in BC, Ontario, Quebec. In many areas, they gained more seats than they did popular vote. And as a result of that, of course, folks will be dissecting the election and expounding on the shortcomings of first past the post. But certainly what's unequivocal with the election results is that the Liberals have a mandate, and the composition of the House will look much the same. But now Prime Minister can say to Parliament, and he will, that after the pandemic, or at least after the outset of the pandemic, Liberal government was elected on a specific mandate, specific commitments, and it's time for Parliament to deliver on that mandate.
Jack, what were you thinking election night?
So I would say I don't think the Liberals have a mandate. They sent back to 2019 the exact same Parliament. The mandate is to work with other parties. I don't think the Liberals should get arrogant enough to say that any policy we put forth, we can just kind of do what we want. You need to work with the NDP, you need to work with the Bloc, and in some instances work with the CPC to get things done. But my high level takeaway is I don't think there's any national party in this election. I think if you look at where the seats are distributed, for example, the NDP did okay in BC, but have really one seat in Quebec. The Liberals did very well, did in Atlantic Canada. Obviously, Fortress Toronto did very well, but are not really doing anything, any substance in Alberta or Saskatchewan. And the Conservatives do very well in Alberta, Saskatchewan, rural Ontario, but can't really penetrate BC too well, can't really get into those urban centers. So when I look at this election, no real party has this national mandate or can like really grab seats across the country. And that's my high level takeaway.
Chris?
So this is the problem when you have my colleague Shaq speak in front of me. He ends up making me look less smart. So I totally agree. I think at the end of the day, listen, the mandate in big parentheticals is shut up and get back to your job, right? Like I think most of the Canadian electorate kind of were willing to hear some other arguments, maybe willing to think maybe I'm going to do something different this time, but basically return the exact same government to the House of Commons with a mandate, as Jack put it, to just get back to work and start working with people. I think there's a validation of the fact that Canadians are comfortable with a bit of that horse trading, a bit of that sort of let's take some ideas from party here, let's take some ideas from party there, because they've seen that work. In a bold partisan sense, I will just say, I think that's also a bit of a reflection of, it's a bit of a thumbs up to some of the work that the NDP did during the last parliament on pushing really hard to say, these are the things that we don't see the government doing that we need you to do. And so for us, I take that as a bit of coin in the bank, maybe not enough coin in the bank, but some coin in the bank. But Canadians also said we don't want the Prime Minister to have both hands in the wheel. Maybe we want 4 or 5 different hands on the wheel, kind of steering the car here.
Marianne, you come from a less partisan perspective. What's your takeaway?
2 key takeaways for me. Firstly, things change along the campaign trail. I know people across the country are frustrated. It's more of the same. But when we went into this election, the Liberals were polling somewhat looking like a majority, which changed quite starkly over the course of the campaign, where the Liberals and CPC were virtually neck and neck. And then you see slip-ups and incidents that happen along the campaign, which ultimately shifts voters' perspectives. And I think it's a lessons learned, and we'll get into this more fruitfully as this discussion goes on what are the key takeaways from the parties. But one thing I don't see enough reporting on, and we certainly do not talk about enough in this country, is the rural and urban divide. We talk a lot about policy issues, and my colleagues touched on it in some way or another already, but evidently the Liberals don't know how to tap into rural areas, and the Conservatives are really struggling to tap into the urban centers, particularly where they needed to win seats. in the 905 GTA areas. And that has a lot to do, I think, with their policy focuses and their target voter base. And I think that's the main takeaway from this election.
Brittany, I mean, notwithstanding the fact that the Liberals won, I mean, we have seen since 2015 a steady erosion of their vote. At the same time, we've seen a steady erosion of turnout, meaning that they're getting fewer and fewer and fewer Canadians actually supporting them as we go along. Yeah, to your point, they do win. And a lot of people talk about the incredible efficiency of the Liberal vote. I mean, for example, in Ontario, they've only got 39% of the popular vote, but an astounding 64% of the seats. In BC, they actually came in third in popular vote, but won the most seats. Explain this to me and the others who are watching. I mean, how does the Liberal Party get that efficiency in its vote?
Well, I'll reserve any lecture on first past the post and just sort of focus on how Liberals, as you say, how they leverage the efficiency of the vote. So they have a significant advantage today and in the last few elections, and it's for a number of reasons. The first is data, and you know, of course, every party will describe how robust their data analytics are, and the Liberals, they too have a very strong system in place and an ability to micro-target voters in a way that we just didn't see a decade ago. That's not new though. Urban centers is a second reason why the vote efficiency is so strong. They contain more seats. And this is important for two reasons. One, logistics, and two, media markets. And there are a lot of reasons, but logistically, it's far easier for campaigns, for example, to share resources when it's so dense. A volunteer in Metro Vancouver can drive to a dozen ridings in less than an hour. That's not the case in rural areas. Take an ad out in a local paper in the GTA, it's going to garner the eyes of far more voters than something published in a rural area. And in the way of seat count, I mean. And then with respect to the Liberals sort of sitting in the center as they do, you know, there's an ability to sort of seize the voters from really all sides. What we've seen and what Hillary illustrated for us is that the Liberals and the New Democrats, at least this time around, they shared a large cross-section of voters who have similar motivations, shared values, and apparently a shared disdain for the Conservative Party.
Shaq, I want to have kind of the same question, but flipped right around, because people also talk about the inefficiency of the Conservative vote. What they're often referring to is that it gets such a huge majority in the prairies that a lot of these votes are wasted. But if you look at Ontario, in 2019, they were 9 points behind. This time, they were not even 4 points behind, yet they didn't win any of those seats in 905. Forget about Toronto proper. Why not?
I think you need to speak to the fact of the PPC. There was obviously a huge role played there. I'm not so sure how much of the actual vote they ate from the Conservatives, but I think the PPC came out and they really took a position on COVID-19 restrictions that no other party was talking about. I think a lot of folks that went to them were kind of saying, we're kind of out of the political consensus. As you noted, they're anti-establishment, and Maxime Bernier really rode that way forward. I think they ate a lot of support from the Conservatives. That being said, with the PPC, I'm not sure. They're a one-time phenomenon. I do think the wave of support they got this year won't occur in future elections. I'm not sure they can really reinvent themselves to be this new party on the right that's just going to eat Conservative support moving forward. The biggest thing there as well is I think Aaron O'Toole kind of positioned himself as this guy who was an Ontario MP, who was going to come become leader of the Conservatives and really gain some seats in the 905. That didn't come to fruition for a variety of reasons. And one of them, I think, and Chris can speak to this as well, but Conservatives really depend on the NDP to do well. I don't think the NDP did as well as we thought they were going to do. They didn't eat a lot of the seats, a lot of the votes on the left side, and we couldn't come up the middle. And that was a huge issue as well. That being said, as a political party that wants to be in government, you can't rely on another party to win seats or win votes for you to become the government in charge, right? So if our strategy is we need a strong NDP to be government, we might be official opposition for decades.
I can get to Chris, but I want to ask you a supplementary on that about the People's Party, because you're hearing that a lot from within the Conservative Party right now. I mean, you're saying that 25 seats the Conservatives lost, that if you looked at their vote plus the People's Party vote, that they could have actually, that combined vote was greater than the margin of victory. And that's becoming kind of part of the narrative of this post-election analysis, that Erin O'Toole lost to Maxime Bernier. How do you see that unfolding in the next little while? Because it strikes me as it has tremendous implications for whether the party attempts to cover its flank on the right, or if it continues to want to try to be a big tent party and expand the vote to Liberal and the NDP voters who haven't been considering them over the course of the last 3 campaigns.
Yeah, I think you kind of touched it already. We've seen commentators and pundits come out in the last 24 hours saying what a failed strategy by Erin O'Toole. The PPC saw an opportunity on the right and they ate the vote from the Conservatives. I'm not so sure that's the right answer to draw, right conclusion to draw here. I think if you are the Conservatives, you need to move to the center. That's where the votes are, right? You can't sit here and say the further you move to the right, I mean, what is it, 30, 31% we usually cap out at? That's not a winning proposition. You need to find a way to moderate your views, appeal to those voters, have conservative solutions to those voters who are in the suburban, even urban areas, and break into those Liberal fortresses, right? I think if you look across Canada, most of these major urban centers, Halifax, Charlottetown, Montreal, Vancouver, Toronto, we didn't get one seat, not one seat. You can't win an election if that's what's going to happen moving forward. So I'm not sure what the solution is, but I think we're going to get to this later. But I think this notion of just change the leader and you'll win the election, that's not the answer. There needs to be some policies we think of, or find a way to break into these seats that really Liberals dominate. Even the NDP have some currency in those areas, but really the Liberals dominate. What are the solutions? What are we missing in that conversation that we just can't break through? And I don't subscribe to this notion that moving towards getting to PPC voters is the way to win an election. If we want to go in that direction, again, we can stay in opposition for decades if that's what we choose to do.
Chris, I have to tell you that the biggest surprise for me personally was that the NDP didn't do better than they did. I mean, they were routinely polling about 3 to 4% higher than their actual result. They had the most popular leader. We saw a big spike in youth vote, yet no breakthrough in urban Canada, especially Toronto, where they previously held a lot of seats in 2011 to 2015. What's happening there?
So just like any of these things, there's a number of layers to this, right? So, I mean, as you say, first off, Jagmeet remained the most liked and trusted leader throughout the entire campaign. Canadians like him. That didn't change at all during the campaign. So a lot of a political coin in the bank there. But at the ballot box, there's a gap. And I think there are a number of just kind of structural and sort of tactical barriers to us actually capitalizing on that. So sometimes you have to kind of differentiate between leader brand and party brand, right? I grew up an organizer, but I'm also a comms guy, right? So when you look behind our campaign, we ran a very Jagmeet focused campaign, which is, again, money in the bank, everybody likes the guy, but it was a one-note campaign, right? So we had a strong opening argument talking about how better is possible, but then if you look at our voting base, they didn't necessarily, they aren't motivated by huge negative campaigns about other leaders. They're not driven necessarily to the polls by those negatives in such a big way. They're driven by big ideas and emotional connection to big ideas. And they're driven to the polls later, right? So they make up their decision during the campaign, not at the start of the campaign like other parties, right? And so we need to kind of zoom out on how we've actually campaigned this time around, in having a strong opening message for a tranche of voters that aren't making their decision at the start of the campaign, having no closing message for a large swath of voters who are making the decision in the last week, and then filling that leader brand out with what are those 1 or 2 big ideas that can be those breakthroughs in urban Canada. But I would also suggest in some of the more working class ridings that are in the GTA. So Shaq talked about some of those vote splits in the north end of Toronto and in the GTA. Those should also be important ridings for us, right? Those should also be important ridings for some of those workers who have found it too hard to find a home in downtown centers. Some of those workers those are union workers that live in a lot of those centers. Where is the party for those types of voters to also kind of broaden that tent a little bit for us as well? So when you pull back back the campaign, there's still a lot of great stuff working for the New Democrats. It's just, how are we as a party, both structurally and message and tactically, taking that great political capital and putting it in the bank? One last thing I will say, and this may sound like griping, but I swear it's not. When you have a leader before us who fundamentally failed at the job in 2015, and then is left to stay on for 2 years, and that puts a bit of rust on the machine, right? Because he's not going anywhere. He knows he's not running the next campaign. So that rust takes a lot of time to kind of chisel away from a fundraising, organizing, training, all these things. And so there is a bit of a hangover. I am referring to Thomas Mulcair. So there's a bit of there is still a bit of a hangover on some of that stuff around how do we continue to like rebuild that machine a little bit. And I think some of that rust on the machine cost us a few seats in downtown Toronto. I think we'll see what happens at Davenport, Spadina, Fort York. We should have been there a little bit more forcefully, but we need to chip some of that rust away. Thankfully, we might have another 2 years before the next campaign to do some of that stuff to help close that deal.
Aaron O'Toole announced yesterday that they're going to have a fairly formal review of their strategies. Is there any such thing happening within the NDP?
I mean, I'm sure there's conversations, right? People always talk after a campaign. It's just prudent to do, right? I think every party at the end of a campaign, I think even the Liberals will probably have a conversation around, okay, what went right, what went wrong? I think that's just prudent, right? So I don't know that the outside narrative around, oh, they're having a policy, they're having a tactical review necessarily points to any problems. It's just a prudent thing to do. I would say that to any client. Once you have a campaign in the field, let's have a debrief, let's talk about it, let's see what worked, what didn't work, how can we optimize, right? And I think every party is going to be doing that right now.
Marianne, you've been monitoring questions there again. Anything you want to put to the panel or answer yourself?
Yeah, there are a few questions and a lot of commentary. There's a question around the Conservatives, and maybe I can target Shaq on this one, noting that they failed to sort of communicate their economic policy and focus on innovation as strategically as they could, and wondering if that was for some Conservative voters, in their view, if that's sort of why Aaron O'Toole wasn't successful.
I don't know if it would be the innovation piece. I think if you look at polling across the board, affordability was kind of the economic issue that Canadians cared about. I think all parties really drove that message forward, right? The thing in a short campaign, you can only target so many policies. The Conservatives had a very comprehensive policy platform come out. They chose a narrative they thought would resonate best with Canadians, and they were doing very well. I mean, listen, till probably midpoint of the campaign, till the gun control debate came up, they were actually doing very well. Gun control really started knocking their popularity. You started seeing on both sides, both the people who started saying, you know what, maybe this guy does have a hidden agenda because he's flip-flopping. And then those true blue Conservatives who were like, oh, okay, you're going to flop on gun control, we can't vote for you. That's when he started to bleed a lot of support. But I think the innovation measures were there. Obviously, if you look at the platform, you see that they're there. But I think as far as a sexy message to a broad array of Canadians, I'm not so sure how many Canadians that appeals to. So they stuck to that message of affordability. And I think it did work to a certain extent, but obviously it didn't work well enough to win the election.
Anything else there, Mac?
Yes. So here's a question. It seemed like the NDP campaign was all about attacking Trudeau and had little else to say. Was this a deliberate effort to thwart strategic voting?
I'm going to say yes. I think at the end of the day, one of my old campaign managers used to tell me that if you don't have a problem with your opponent, the electorate won't either. So yes, obviously there was a bit of a concerted effort to try to drive down or drive home some of that antipathy towards the prime minister that was still brewing really at the start of the campaign, right? So there was this really big anger moment at the start. People were kind of frustrated. Why are we having a campaign? What have these guys done? Oh my God. And then they saw some of that anger actually physically manifested with, the protests and the gravel being thrown. I think people then went, okay, I'm angry, but I'm not that angry, right? And so I think at the end of the day, that was very much a deliberate thing for us to try to drive some of those positives down for the Liberal leader. but you have to backstop it with something, right? So at the end of the day, you can't just go with a campaign. And I'm not saying that that's exactly what happened, but you have to pick a fight. You have to have a contrast, but that contrast has to lead to something else on the other end. We just have to, I think, have a little bit of a better idea of putting a button on it at the end about Trudeau bad, we better, and here's why, right?
Let's move forward here, because we've got an election result that looks almost exactly like 2019. We're going to have a parliament that looks exactly like the one we had when the writs were issued. What's changed? I mean, Brittany, is Justin Trudeau's hand strengthened or weakened by this election outcome, given his latitude to deal with Parliament and to pursue his agenda?
Well, whether the Prime Minister is strengthened or weakened may depend on your political affiliation, as you've seen earlier in the show. In all seriousness, you know, my colleagues Chris and Shaq described how the voters' message is around getting back to work, and that it was a minority, it's a minority government. Of course, Prime Minister went into this election, Liberals went into this election thinking, you know, a majority would be ideal. So that's right. And I don't mean to sound overly glib. A minority requires things that I think most Canadians value. So, you know, collaboration, getting creative, leveraging a broader spectrum of policy, philosophy. These are things I think that Canadians like. But I do think, like, there is without a doubt a renewed sense that the Prime Minister does have this mandate to govern. You know, what the Prime Minister and the Liberals were elected on 2 years ago, it looks a lot different than what they were elected on today, at least in my opinion. With the outset of the pandemic, you know, they had to shift. They had to shift quite a bit in order to accommodate for that. Now, they will need to partner with willing parties, of which I suspect there will be no shortage of in the immediate term, including the NDP, maybe the Bloc, and hopefully the Conservatives. So yes, it's a minority. Yes, the seat count looks virtually unchanged, but I do think now he's able to stand up in Parliament, the Prime Minister, and say, we were elected on a specific mandate, on specific commitments, and now it's time for Parliament to deliver on that.
Any others have thoughts on that? I think it's a question that, you know, obviously is big, but I don't know that it's settled. I mean, is Justin Trudeau in a stronger position now than before, or is he in a weaker position?
I think there's a fine line. Right. I think there, as we've seen time and time again, we've seen this government sometimes not know the mood of the country and the connection of this, like, overly enthusiastic, like, we have this big mandate, we have all this. And I don't know that the country's there. Right. I don't know. I think after the election, there'll be a grace period. There'll be a bit of a, like, okay, like, we sent y'all back to work, please just shut up while I get my kid back to school and test them a million times for COVID and make sure that they're safe. But that is a very fine line to walk, right? I was even just watching Streeter interviews the other day where people were being asked directly by media, like, how do you feel about this? They're like, you know what, like, it's fine, it's over, but if he does it again, I swear, like, they are going to hear about it, right? So I think there's a rhetorical line that maybe it's more style versus substance, but, you know, the chest beating and the, like, what we heard on election night, I feel if that continues over the next, you know, 6 months to a year, I think that's going to turn a lot of people off, right? I think a bit more humility, a bit more seeing, going around the shop and talking to folks, and actually really building a bit more of a coalition without there being sort of a formal coalition in place would probably do them well. But what do I know?
We'll get into that too. But Marianne, I see you guys nodding. Do you want to add anything here?
Yes, and I know we're going to get into this a little bit more, but I think Canadians are ready to move forward past COVID, getting back to sort of business. The majority of the Liberals' 2019 tenure has been, for the last 2 years, basically focused around the COVID-19 pandemic. And now that we're sort of in the fourth wave or exiting the fourth wave, or however you want to frame it. There's a lot of frustrated people who are, I think, as they're looking towards 2022, what's next? Where can we start focusing on the economy again, or our labor shortages, or these sorts of things, and less discussion around the pandemic? And as many thought the election was going to focus on those key issues, it turned into a wedge issue election, which also frustrated the electorate. So I think whether it's focused on the prime minister or the other leaders, I think Canadians don't want to see the infighting. They want to see parliamentarians working collaboratively together and getting to work and getting the economy back on track.
We all know that elections have major impact on leadership, and we're hearing a lot of talk now, Shaq, that the more right of center elements of the party are taking exception to the basic strategy that was employed in this particular campaign of trying to move the party more to the center rather than being a true blue conservative that Aaron O'Toole positioned himself as to win the leadership. Are you anticipating a big fight within the Conservative Party now going forward as a distraction from the other things they might be pursuing?
So I think on the first part, you're obviously going to hear a lot of commentary from folks saying the strategy didn't work. Party needs to, the moderate views didn't work. But I'm not sure how representative those folks are actually of party members, right? So I think ignore that noise. The second part is Aaron O'Toole is going to have to go back to caucus and have some very tough discussions, especially if you look at where our caucus, what constitutes our caucus, right? Alberta, rural areas. That being said, we touched on this point earlier. We need to win in the 905. We need to win in urban areas. I'm not so sure going back to caucus members who live in the West or live in rural areas are the way to provide solutions to win in urban areas. So despite those tough conversations, I think Aaron O'Toole needs a bit more time to present his strategy. He didn't control the timing of the election. I'm pretty sure it was a political calculus. The Canadians didn't know Aaron O'Toole that well. He didn't really have his ideas formulated at the start of the campaign, even though he had his platform. No one knew where he was going to take this party. I think he needs more time to present a more moderate view to Canadians. And I also think as you move forward, there are these one-time election things that I think really derailed his campaign. The PPC, as we spoke about before, but also Jason Kenney. It wasn't ideal timing to introduce a vaccine passport days before the election. I don't think the Liberals could have wrote a better script to say, look at the Conservatives, don't know what to do with COVID-19. They wait till the very last minute, they flip-flop, causing hundreds of thousands of deaths. And clearly, Trudeau used that in the last 2-3 days of the campaign to campaign against Aaron O'Toole. So I think, of course, there's going to be tough conversations. Of course, there's going to be infighting. But as I said before, just changing the leader doesn't change the policy solutions. Just changing the leader is not going to get you into urban areas. So there needs to be a bigger and a broader conversation about what do we actually need to do to break into these urban centers, to break into these suburban centers. And just saying Aaron O'Toole sucks is not the way to do this. I don't even, if you can tell me a superstar conservative waiting in the wings, please let me know that person's name, because I don't know any superstar that's going to come up behind Aaron O'Toole and lead this party to victory.
Chris, in the last parliament, Jagmeet Singh and the NDP were more than prepared to negotiate to support the Trudeau agenda and Trudeau legislation budgets. Are they going to be as amenable this time? And are they also going to want something in return for the support that they didn't necessarily get last time?
Yeah, I mean, I think you heard Jagmeet on election night that he's going to continue the posture that we continued in the last parliament of we're willing to dance on certain things. I think obviously childcare is one of them. We talked a bunch about that. There could be like pharmacare, childcare, all these things, that there is alignment between the NDP
think he might
and
push pharmacare as a condition of support.
I think so. I think I think that's an active place for discussion for sure. I think we're going to see us operate the same way we did last parliament, but with maybe a little bit more force, right? On drawing a few more lines around, here are the things that matter to us, and here are the deadlines that we need you to be on, and we need you to get this stuff done, right? And so that has been a core theme for us throughout this last parliament is great. You can come to us and you can say all these nice, pretty things, but at the end of the day, like, let's lock it in, let's get it done, let's get some deadlines going, let's get a plan together. And I think you're going to see us probably be a little bit more aggressive on that approach in this new parliament.
But no prospect of a formal coalition between the NDP and
listen, formal coalitions are political dynamite. And I don't mean in the 1970s like dynamite way. I mean in the like it could blow up your political career way. Just ask Andrew Weaver in BC, where they signed the confidence and supply agreement, which sounded like a really great idea. And then we basically subsumed him into the host body and made him absolutely irrelevant for the next campaign, right? So I'm gonna probably say hard pass on a formal agreement, because also like at the end of the day, like we've been clear about what we want, right? It's not like we're hiding anything. It's not like there's like we've aired these things over the last year or 2 years in the campaign, before the campaign, and then during the campaign. So come talk to us. That's cool. Like we'll negotiate, because that's working, right? And also, I think that's part of the mandate the Canadians sent the Prime Minister, was like, keep talking to these guys. We don't need you to formalize nothing. Like it's working. Like let's do that, right? So I think it's going to be a hard no, and I think the price would be pretty high for us to be included in any sort of formal coalition that I don't think the Liberals would probably be very interested in. Like we're talking like some major cabinet posts.
Marianne, what about the other party leaders? I mean, what's going to happen to Annamie Paul and Maxime Bernier? What's their fate?
For Annamie Paul, I think if people were tuning into the election coverage, it was a pretty big upset for her. Coming in at fourth in her riding to the former finance minister Bill Morneau's riding, which is now Marcian. But having people say she won the last English debate and added a lot of valid points around the lack of diversity of not just representation in Parliament, but also just various perspectives. Unfortunately, the infighting in the Green Party really impacted Annamie Paul. It appears that there's no clear path forward for her. She was not successful in winning her seat. It's unlikely she'll remain the leader of the party. There are now, while there's still a few ridings still being finalized in terms of the final outcome, it's clear we have two Green elected MPs, one new in Kitchener Centre and Elizabeth May, and they're going to have to also go back to the drawing board. Does Elizabeth May become leader again? Like that's not.
I was going to ask you. You think that
that's not an unlikely scenario?
Listen to her press conference on election night, and I think she already is.
So
what about Maxime Bernier? Is he going to just continue to trudge along, or does he now just fade into the ether?
Well, there's a number of folks who really strongly feel that the PPC was a one-issue party, as we've discussed on this panel, focusing on COVID-19 and the anti-vaccine sentiment, but I tend to disagree with that. As we've spoken about internally, Maxime Bernier and his party doesn't have to play by the same rules. They were not elected. It's more of I would argue, more of a movement. We have seen them grow strategically. I think there's certainly the sentiment of the more right-wing party. I heard on a number of radio shows yesterday that people said they voted for them because they felt the Conservative Party has lost their conservative values, and it was a protest vote. I'm not so certain that this is a one-off. I think there is certainly a way that party can grow. And I think Maxime Bernier wasn't surprised that he lost, but he at the end of the day got over 5% of the vote, and we're still crunching the numbers, Alan, but a number of ridings indicate that if those 2,500 to 5,000 votes that went to the PPC in certain ridings, and you add those up into the Conservatives who lost, it could have been a very different election outcome. And so this is a long-winded way of saying that I think we have to stay tuned. And I think if people think this is just a one issue, I vehemently disagree. I think there's more to come from Maxime Bernier's party.
Yves-François Blanchet, also like Jagmeet Singh and the NDP, was more than prepared to negotiate to support the Trudeau agenda last time. This election, we see the Premier of Quebec intervene and basically say the best thing for Quebec would be a minority Conservative. government. Any sense that this is going to make the bloc more aggressive in Parliament, more hostile, less likely to cooperate?
That's really interesting, Alan. And we haven't spoken enough about the bloc than I think we probably should. And lest we forget, they were the third party in the last parliament, not the NDP. They have a really prominent role. I think in terms of maintaining language rights and highlighting some of the provincial issues or provincial policy focus around the bill that focuses on religious symbols and very prominently focused on secularism and the dynamics that plays out in the federal sphere is going to continue to be front and center. But I certainly think they are going to be able to, depending on where the Liberals focus their attention, on issues like pharmacare, the bloc is vehemently against because they feel strongly that there's already a system in place in Quebec. So I think it really comes down to issue-specific policies wherein the bloc can ultimately change the outcome or the focus, and that's when the sort of informal negotiation behind the scenes with the various parties is going to take place.
Brittany, I mean, regardless of the outcome, you said it, the Prime Minister said it, he has a mandate. What is it? What's going to be his top legislative priorities when he calls that House back and has the speech from the throne?
Well, finishing the COVID, finishing the fight against COVID, I think will be part of it for sure, especially when we see the fourth wave as rampant as it is in some provinces and some areas of the country. So, robust vaccination program, childcare, thankfully, childcare, climate action, thinking about how to really sort of sees that issue as a Liberal champion issue. It's something the Prime Minister and his cabinet, his caucus care deeply about. Housing affordability, Indigenous reconciliation. I do look forward to seeing Prime Minister talk about what the economic recovery does look like beyond the investments that are being made, which are, of course, as some of our attendees have noted, is substantial. So things like labor shortage, the tourism and hospitality sector. What will the recovery for that look like? Because that's significant in many parts of the country. Innovation economy, maybe with respect to the vaccination program, what does emergency preparedness or national defense, how does our innovation economy play into those areas where maybe in the past it wasn't? So, it's going to be an exciting few years. I look forward to it.
Jack, that Brittany just mentioned, among other things, the government's national childcare program. They've got 8 provinces on side before this election took place. What is the chance of signing up Doug Ford? And if they can, what are the implications for the federal Progressive Conservative Party if that happens?
I think the chances of Doug Ford signing on are actually pretty high. Before this election, we saw a few stories coming out from Education Minister Lecce. I even think the Premier's office themselves were saying they were close to a deal. Obviously, need to negotiate the fine print. But when I look at someone like Doug Ford, he was willing to work with anybody who won, whether it was Justin Trudeau or Erin O'Toole. I think he's heading into an election year. There's no way he leaves all that money on the table. There's no way he abandons a policy that is very beneficial to parents throughout the province. So I think they'll continue to hammer away the details, and there'll be a deal on the table definitely before E-Day in Ontario. I think the implications for the federal Conservatives, quite honestly, just takes the issue off the table. We can debate whether, just because I mean, both parties think childcare is important. Obviously, the Conservatives thought the best way to solve this issue was to put money in people's pockets and have them choose. The Liberals had a different way of going about it, more of a government-to-government transfer of money, create more spaces, obviously get it to $10 a day. That's totally fine to have that discussion, but I think moving that off the table, we can talk about other issues. I don't think the Conservatives are going to sit here and say, you know what, we just are so against your idea that we're going to run aggressively against this in the next election. Let's move on to bigger things. Let's move on to more priorities. I think at the end of the day, all parties want to make sure parents can have affordable childcare. Again, there's different ideas about how you actually get to that outcome.
Earlier in the conversation, Marianne, that Shaq mentioned affordability. I can't recall a campaign where affordability was as big an issue as it was in this election, and the work that we're doing, the public opinion work that we're doing, especially among young people, especially in urban centers, focused quite specifically on housing, but broader, much more broadly. The items that Brittany mentioned are kind of a continuation of what the government was doing before. Do you anticipate any new initiatives from this government around affordability issues?
Oh, certainly. There's a number of issues that were in the platform, ranging from housing, as you mentioned, to incentives for small business, to upscale technology, to a variety of other social programs that are set to help Canadians. But listen, they're very targeted, very micro-focused to certain demographics, continuing on the young families, certain groups. But what was interesting, Alan, if I may, about this election in particular, and I haven't been around that many elections, but I will say, I think based on our discussions internally and on a number of pieces that I've read, is that I think it's fair to say Canada hasn't had an election that was so focused on housing. You had an affordability and having young people, and I remember Hillary mentioning to me yesterday, there's a lot of data on key issues for people under 40. It's not just the housing pieces, it's affordability generally, whether it's groceries, cost of transportation, all these sorts of things, and not just in the urban centers. And that played quite squarely in this election campaign, but it's going to continue to have to be threaded in the Liberals' initiatives, in their speech from the throne, in the federal budget in 2022, because it's not only just in the back pockets of the Canadians in their personal lives, but we see, I'm certain that there's not one person across this country that hasn't walked down their street and seen a sign up looking for help for employees. And there's real grassly felt labor shortages right now due to COVID and some of the programs that have been offered in terms of EI. And they're going to have to balance the public health and safety of Canadians with also supporting small businesses and ensuring that they're able to get back on track as we navigate the recovery side of things.
As always happens, we're running out of time. So I want to close by asking each of you, what do you anticipate in terms of the dynamic and the tone of this next parliament? And more specifically, how long do you think it's going to last? Chris?
I think that, again, you're going to see a bit of a grace period for the first, 6 months or so. I think you're going to see, the speech from the throne. People is going to nod. People are going to be happy about it. It's fine. But then you're going to see a bit of a reset back to what we saw towards the end of this last parliament. I think you're going to see a lot of folks trying to carve out space, a lot more horse trading, a lot more hot rhetoric. You're going to see a little bit more on the committee side, some more of that obstructionism happening. Like, I don't think that the calculus of this could be a workable minority for longer than 18, for like 3 years, some people have said. I'm not sure that that's where we're going to be at. I think we're probably about 18, maybe 24 months at best.
Which is kind of average. Jack?
Average, yeah.
Sorry, I would agree with Chris in terms of the timeline, 18 to 24 months, but in terms of the tone, I think the Conservatives are going to be hard negative. You saw it in Aaron O'Toole's speech after the election, went right into almost, it was like campaign mode, calling out the $600 million election, saying we're going to hold him to account. Like, his tone was very puzzling, given that he didn't do as well as we thought he was going to do. So I don't see them compromising on anything. And I think in opposition, we saw over the last 2 years, the Conservatives are the party of no. So they're probably going to say no to everything the Liberals want to put forth. And I think they realize too, with all due respect to the Prime Minister, there was a large undercurrent of dislike for him personally. There was a lot of people on the campaign, a lot of voters just didn't like Justin Trudeau. And I think they might try to tap into that in some way, not in a way that's going to be political or kind of any kind of violent sense, but I think the notion of it's his time to go. I can see that current being driven quite aggressively by the Conservatives as we move forward.
Marianne?
Well, the Liberals have been in power since 2015, right? The notion of sunny ways is somewhat over, and while they've been reelected again, I think this is a very, very different mandate under a minority government. I wish I would be more optimistic, but I think it's going to be an uphill battle, not just for the Liberals, but for a number of the parties in navigating COVID recovery, but also getting the economy back on track. And I'm hoping we'll see a respectful and collegial parliament who is willing to put some of that partisanship aside now that the election's over to focus on the best interests of Canadians.
Last word to you, Brittany.
Last word, thrilling. It's going to be a really exciting parliament, and I can't wait to see it.
With on that happy note, I want to thank all of you who've joined us. We didn't get to your specific questions. We will write you directly. And as well, we will send everyone a link to this conversation so that you can share it with your friends if that's your want. And otherwise, take care of yourself and be well. Thank you very much.